Well, good morning. General Simpson, I feel honored that I'm in good company because that's the exact reaction I have when I look at my BlackBerry in the morning. So, well, it's a real pleasure to be here, on behalf of Defense Contract Management Agency and our director, Lieutenant General Wendy Masiello. DCMA plays a key role kind of across the board in acquisition, and I wanted to provide you a look kind of from our seat and where we see things. We're certainly the collective we, and I will say, that's from the government buying side, the folks that are in the administration seats like DCMA and contractors can all improve. And General Simpson's remarks were spot on. This is truly a team sport. And as we have come to foster a climate of one that we term detection to prevention, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. We see opportunities across the board to really get acquisition moving, if you will. So next slide, please. And I have a few slides. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this, but I did want to leave folks with a handout for some points of contact and just maybe a memory jogger as we go through each of our individual places in the acquisition role. So next slide. This is where DCMA falls in the span of defense acquisition. So we are one of the fourth estate activities under AT&L currently until the reorg kicks in 2018. And if anybody knows where we're going then, I'd be really interested in hearing. So as a fourth estate activity, as the gentleman mentioned, we do play across all the services and across all of our acquisition buying partners and have a pretty unique view of defense acquisition. Next slide. So our mission statement, and I think this is very apropos in today's environment, is that we are the independent eyes and ears of the Department of Defense and its partners, delivering actionable acquisition insight from the factory floor to the front line around the world. And that is DCMA's role. We, in fact, have folks in every major buying activity, every major geographical location. We, in fact, are both CONUS and in overseas locations, as well as supporting, contingency operations on the battlefield. And the biggest thing that I think we can provide, in addition to ensuring, product acceptance and payment of items, is that acquisition insight. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means kind of as we roll across that acquisition timeline. Next slide, please. Now, these are some big gee-whiz statistics, and they aren't here to impress you. But they are here to kind of let you know what our span of perspective is, and I'll put it that way. So right now, obligated amounts of dollars across the department, about $2 trillion. And when you look at what's in flow in any given, series or POM cycle, it's anywhere from $2 to $6 trillion of money that, potentially could get obligated on defense contracts. 350,000 active contracts out there on behalf of the department. Typically in a year, over 1,300 aircraft accepted. And that's both modification type airplanes that are being modified, whether they're coming off the production line and we're doing, specialized modifications on them, whether it's new production or old tired iron that's going through the overhaul and rework cycle. So again, across that acquisition cycle, there's no shortage of the type of folks that need to be recruited and trained in order to manage the business of the department. And you could take that same logic for aircraft and apply it to Army artillery or Army wheeled tracked and wheeled vehicles. It's the same thing. We own everything from that new acquisition all the way through, and it presents challenges in each one of those contract acquisitions. Government property out there, $162 billion of government property that's got to be accounted for, all of which takes time and effort, away from how we use our time and effort in awarding and managing and maintaining new contracts. So, again, when you start looking at some of these big numbers, think about what goes behind the ability to maintain systems and how do we do that better as a community. Performance-based payments. Payments per day, this is a big one. So, we jokingly kind of talked about the shutdown a little bit in good humor. But the last time, we had a shutdown and we had furloughed our employees, phone was ringing off the hook because everywhere from large business all the way down through the pipeline, DCMA authorizes $455 million in payments each and every day. So an impact of the shutdown, it's kind of funny when you hear it on the radio and you hear a lot of pundits talking about, oh, it doesn't matter, let the government shut down. I submit to you that in our business, it impacts everybody from, Peoria to Poughkeepsie and everywhere in between. Again, DCMA is about 11,500 people. We're located around the globe. We have about $1.4 billion in budget authority. 85% of that is contract salaries. So, that's a lot of money. But you ask, what do we do? And I will tell you that we've been looking our business slightly different, and we find that the return on investment from our people is about 2.5 to 3 times what the budget is. And how do we do that? I'll show you in a minute. Next slide, please. So we've recently started looking at our business a little bit differently. We've started asking, what is our return on investment? And we find that, our major roles fall into one of these areas that we call capabilities. And for most of the folks in the room, you're going to be worried about those primary capabilities because that's how we acquire and deliver military hardware. So we have to worry about things like proper payment. We have to worry about things like indirect cost control. We have to worry about things like contractor effectiveness. We have to worry about things like negotiation intelligence. What's the price of the item? Is that a good value and deal for the government? And then how do we maintain all these contracts that are out there? For every contract that's awarded, there's a lengthy administration cycle that says that, hey, we're accepting the things, whether it's a paper deliverable or a piece of military hardware that the government's procured and is entitled to. And then at the end of all that, we've got to close those contracts. So if we look at all this in terms of the acquisition cycle, let's go to the next chart. This is really and I'll call it a lot of the hidden acquisition pipeline where we have the ability to make a difference. And, I would submit to you that the things above the line, if you're the average program manager, may be transparent to you. It's certainly not transparent to your contracting officer, okay? But I would submit that, the average program manager probably worries more about things below the line because once things are on contract, we're worried about delivery. We're worried about technical problems. We're worried about, ensuring that, items get delivered and issues solved quickly in order to facilitate that delivery. But I just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit more about the things above the line because I think these are our hidden targets of opportunity. Especially if you looked at, how do we deliver those capabilities? And I would submit that, if you're an industry contractor, you should kind of be worried almost about those similar capabilities. So how do we collectively get to the end point, knowing maybe that we have slightly different goals? But at the end, I think we all have the same goal. The same goal was delivering that piece of hardware for that young man or woman out there on the battlefield. So let's talk a little bit. I would just point toward forward pricing rates. Why does that matter to the Department of Defense to have a good forward pricing rate in place? Well, I pointed out that we have some $2 trillion worth of obligated contracts and, another 4 to 6 trillion in the works. What does a forward pricing rate do for us, right? Well, it truly helps streamline the acquisition process. If we have a pre-negotiated rate, an overhead rate with industry, and typically those overhead rates make up nearly 50% of the value of a contract, okay? If those rates are pre-negotiated, the only thing we're arguing about at the table is what are those direct charges, okay? So talk about the ability to streamline, a contract action. There's a big one right there. We talk about overhead should cost reviews. Now, why does that matter? If you're not a contracting person, even maybe what is that, right? So we go out annually to our contractor or to our customer base, and we ask our service acquisition executives, to identify those contractors and segments, that they desire us to go in and look at, where there may be opportunities for savings in those overhead rates. Where do we think perhaps, the business base has gone either one way or another that might drive some of those rates, right? So, those overhead should cost rates really help drive affordability. And the rate reviews that we put in place help drive affordability to the department in an era when every nickel and dime counts. So when DCMA comes out and we're doing those reviews, an understanding of why they're being done and the transparency that's required to get to that common understanding is really important. There's another big one up there called commercial item analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one. But the department is very serious. We talk about how do we get technology out there sooner? How do we attract non-standard buyer or non-standard developers into the market? Well, it's through that commercial item, and we'll talk a little bit more about maybe what that is and what it means and what the outlook is for the department. We in that pre-award part of the acquisition life cycle, we assist major buyers in making those affordability and financial viability decisions. So, as the department looks to where do we award a contract, how do we collectively, as an industrial base, validate that we are capable of producing and that a contractor chosen has the financial capability, the technical capability to do, in fact, what the government is asking. Contractor business systems. This is another one where we have a number of key business systems. I'll just pick a few: property management, accounting, material management, earned value management. These are things where the contractor base comes in and talks to us about, hey, here's our procedures on how we do accounting. Here's how, we ensure that we're complying with all the contract administration and award type standards that are out there, the government auditing standards. And what DCMA does with folks like DCAA, and we go out and we look at a system and we'll say, are you complying with your own command media? So we don't dictate how that has to be done. We say it has to be done in an acceptable manner and fashion. But what we're really checking is, are you following your own processes and procedures? And when we find that there is a significant deficiency in one of those business systems, for a time, life kind of stops for all of us. We've got to go, we've got to write a corrective action request. Industry's got to go and they've got to put a bunch of effort into determining what's the root cause of that business deficiency. We've then got to collectively get together and say, do we agree on what that root cause is? What's the corrective action plan? How are we going to implement this? And quite frankly, many of these issues drag on for months, sometimes years, before we get to a corrective system, a corrective action plan that gives us a compliant business system. And you ask, well, why is a compliant business system important to the government? Well, it's important because we have to have the ability to understand that the data coming out of that system, the data coming out of an accounting system, for example, is something that the government can rely on. You know, if we can't rely on data coming out of an accounting system, how do we know that our money's being spent the way that we had requested? How do we know that we have the right people charging to a contract? How do we know that we're maximizing our dollar for that young man or woman on the battlefield? So all of these type pieces that are transparent, again, many times to the immediate acquisition workforce, and I'll point to the PMs and folks, play a very heavy role into speed of acquisition. We also have over 1,000 cost and pricing analysts. We have a cost and pricing center. We have teams that we call integrated cost analysis teams that sit in our contract management offices. We also have just individuals that sit in geographic areas who have a cost and pricing specialty. And their job when a buying activity asks for help is to get us down the road, to understand what the costs are they reasonable, you know, and how do we know? What's the data that we have to support that? And that capability is in fact very, very important, but it's important to all of us if we're being transparent in the process, right? So in order for the government to get a good deal, we've got to know that it's, you know, the costs are valid and justified, and then it's a reasonable deal. So again, I submit that, you know, we spend a lot of time in negotiations trying to get to that transparency and the reasonability piece. So the other piece we spend a lot of time is arguing back and forth on perhaps what's the right level of data that we need to support a deal, right? So I think having those discussions earlier and upfront in the process really does streamline that timed acquisition. And then lastly, you know, why do we care about contract closeout? Well, I would tell you that canceling funds plays a really big role in today's day and age. We don't want to leave $1 on a contract if we can take that dollar and respend it, you know, back in defense acquisition. And what happens is when we get to the point and that money expires, we can recover those dollars, but it in fact goes back to the Treasury. So really it does us very little good. Next slide. You know, we talked about commercial item determination. You know, this was an imperative in the 2013 NDAA, and they want commercial acquisition, you know, to be supported by our buying commands. So DCMA went and set up a number of commercial item hubs. To date, we've reviewed over 1,600 items for commercial item determinations, and we've made 95% of those items as commerciality recommendations to the program managers. 90 of those cases, 90 cases of those determinations required some amount of pricing determination. And of $977 million, you know, pro-offered for the value of those items, you know, we had an average of about 13% recommended savings back to our program managers. Okay, so you talk about transparency, talk about data to support the determination. All those things become very, very important when you're talking about speed to acquisition, even in the commercial item market. We are also out establishing agreements with companies. We have 3 major agreements in place, and we have 2 others on the way with some of our bigger primes that says, hey, when you present an item, here's the data we need, and here's the data that we need to support that item pricing. So if we can get those kind of agreements in up front, as those commercial items come forward, those determinations should be able to be made very quickly. And also the contracting action should be able to get done very quickly because we already know the data that's pro-offered is right, it's correct, it's what we can use to make a reasonable determination for the government. Next slide. So this is the last slide I'll pro-offer to you. You know, we talk about, the general said, hey, we've got to strike a balance between speed and compliance. And I will tell you that's exactly what our detection to prevention initiative was. This started out as a quality initiative in DCMA where we said, hey, what are the things that we're doing, the things that we're overlaying on industry that are onerous, whereby if we had good data, perhaps we wouldn't have to have a number of government hold points where we actually go out and check the contractor. So we started looking internally at our own processes, but then we came to realize very quickly that this detection to prevention model can be used across all of our equities. So if you look at what the contractor's equities are, and I would say that these are things at your disposal that helps you meet your end item objective, whether it's delivering a warfighting piece of product, or it's making profit for your company, right? These are the items that we worry about, that you have control over. And you look at what the buying command worries about, and you look at what DCMA worries about. What are the things that we've got to be assured of before we award a contract or we recommend award of a contract to a buying activity or before we deliver an end item? And our intent is to work with industry and work with our buying activity partners to be able to move close to that blue center section. So as we mature our processes, and I'll give you a great example. We recently worked with an acquisition buying activity. They came in and they were doing a major overhaul on a fairly new airplane. And they came in and they said, hey, we're getting ready to award this contract. You guys accept over 800 refurbished airplanes every year. Can you look at this and can you tell us what's going on? Or are we in the right ballpark? Are we going to be able to achieve our objectives? And we looked at it and we found things like clauses that were inappropriate. We found requirements that were ill-defined. We found contract structure that was bad, delivery dates that weren't clearly articulated that could have resulted in contractor penalties, if they weren't articulated. So at the end of the day, we went back and gave the folks about 80 pages of comments on the contract, and they looked at it and they said, wow, we're going to take a step back because you're right. We need to go fix all these things. So that's a great example. So the question earlier about, hey, how do we understand the requirements process better? How do we help define those requirements adequately in a contract that we all understand what's in there is really what gets us down the road. Because when problems come up, we've got issues well defined or the ability to tackle those issues. I'll give you another great example. We also had an in-production program, and this is on the flip side, a situation that probably went on too long, where we're having tremendous production problems, on an item for a very key piece of hardware that went on over 18 months before the collective we, contractor, program office, DCMA, came together and said, hey, we can't let this go on anymore. What can we all collectively do to fix that problem? And you ask yourself, well, why does that happen? Well, program manager's worried about keeping the project on track. He wants to keep things moving. DCMA wants to get in there and help. We want to help. We want to help assess things and keep it moving. So we don't want to pull the red flag too early. Contractors obviously got vested interests in continuing down the road, continuing the progress payments. And at some point, to the general's point about accountability, we've all got to put up our hands and say, stop. And had we done that 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had the time and money wasted on that program that we saw. But we were all complicit in it, all three parties. And I will tell you, that's a big piece of this, is holding ourselves accountable, figuring out what we can do in each one of our process areas to stop the things that are halting our ability to make speed in the acquisition cycle. And that's all what detection to prevention is all about. It's finding that transparency and accountability and making sure that we are all key players in speeding acquisition to the end line. Next slide. So just some points of contact. If you go back and you start thinking about these things and say, hey, gee, we really need to brush up on some of these things. We really need to work a little harder in that forward pricing rate. We really need to understand your cost and pricing groups a little more. These are some folks that can help you. Mr. Tim Callahan is here with me today. You'll hear from Tim later. He's our Director of Contracts. And here's some folks, please feel free to contact them for any entry point into DCMA that you may need, whether it's worrying about our current contract or worrying about that future one. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Ms. Greening, and maybe for General Simpson as well, what are the trends over the last 4 or 5 years on contract protests and other legal challenges to contracts? Are you seeing that increasing, and how does that disrupt the process that you just described?
Tim, any feel from your hand?
Normally, the protests go to buying activities.
Right.
So we don't. Normally, the protests would be with the buying activities during their contracting process. So we, DCMA, don't normally receive those except for the few contracts that we put out each year. There has been an increase in protests, but I think if you look at the suspension rate, I think you'll see that really hasn't increased. So there's been some legislation, in fact, I think that actually talks about frivolous protests and trying to do away with that, recognizing that, you know, if there really isn't a ground for the protest, it's going to consume a lot of resources in the process while we wait. It delays, in some cases, the start of a contract and eventually getting capability to the warfighter. So, you know, certainly there are opportunities and reasons for protests, and we're not trying to discourage them, but at the same time, there's got to be a good basis other than, in some cases, an incumbent perhaps that might protest in order to continue to perform for a period while the protests are being resolved. So a lot of issues there. We haven't seen a great impact from the DCMA standpoint.